that must have been an extremely harrowing experience, to have this ideology drilled into you with such dire consequences if you didn't toe the line.
Yes, yes, it was. They originally I started out as a Catholic. You know, when you're
Mm,
Catholic, they have the concept of original sin, so they do the
yes, I'm a
baptism
Catholic.
before you're, yeah, okay. And my mom was Catholic, dad was Protestant.
hmm
First
Same,
conflict,
same.
yeah, yeah, same here. So I don't know if it was the case when your parents got married, but when mine were, my father had to go to classes with mom and learn about Catholicism, sign agreements. The kids
Yeah,
would be Catholic. They
that
even
was
had
yeah, that was
a,
it.
yeah, they had a fence across the front of the church. My dad was not allowed to approach the altar. So in their wedding photos, there's actually a fence behind them. And that was my
Wow.
first realization when I asked about that. Why is that fence there? And, they told me my dad wasn't quite Christian enough.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And and I had that conversation with my father, um my mother wanted a church wedding, and in order to get that, my father had to sign the documents and agree that the
yes,
children would be Catholic. So they were willing to do it, but they were always sort of at arm's length, weren't they?
yeah, yeah. Our family, my father was from Kentucky and mom was from Wisconsin.
Mm,
And when we moved back here in my early childhood, that's when we started going to my father's church. And
yeah.
the tables really flipped there. That's when the young earth creationist told me that I, as a Catholic, was not a Christian.
Yeah.
And after much indoctrination, and I joined the church, I started worrying about my mother not being a Christian. And they told me
Mm,
point blank, yes, your mother's going to burn forever if you don't save her. And I
mm.
was being sent by God to save my mother at that point,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
a lot of pressure to put on a little kid, as you
On
can
a kid,
imagine.
absolutely. Yeah. Gosh. And how did that make you feel, when they told you, you have to save your mother is gonna burn for all eternity if you don't.
I was horrified.
Mm,
I was already having nightmares about me not making it into heaven.
hmm
And then when I started thinking about my mom, I still recall very vivid nightmares of, in detail of me, on the proverbial cloud looking over and seeing my mom screaming and on fire,
hmm
skin peeling off, pleading with me to help her. She loved me and she had taken care of me. And I would just wake up in tears and screaming in terror. Uh,
mm,
it affected me, when I was awake. It affected me when I was asleep. It
yeah.
became a mission to save my mother. And
hmm
she, of course, having a more adult view of this, realized there are many faiths, and that we have many faiths in our family. And she tried to talk me down from that, but by that time I was so deep into the church that I was told that was the only religion. That was the only true
Yeah,
religion. And
yeah,
how often do we hear that these days?
yeah, exactly, exactly. And when in your journey did you sort of realize, okay, when did you decide you had to break out of this church, this fundamentalist mindset?
It took decades. It
A
happened
decade.
slowly.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the book that I wrote about this Journey to Reason. It really was a
Journey to
journey. It
reason. Yeah.
lasted for years. Around age 17 or 18, I finally told my father I wasn't going to go to his church anymore, and that caused a lot of anger.
hmm
But I was getting ready to go away to college, so there wasn't much that anybody could do to force me. I still didn't give up on religion by any means at that point,
Mm.
but a lot of things had been chipped away. The science that young Earth creationism teaches, I was smart enough as a kid to understand that what I was being told about science wasn't wrong. And I lived in kind of two worlds, which led to a lot of mental conflict because
hmm
I would
hmm
go out at night and look at the stars and realize I was seeing something that was hundreds of millions or billions of years old. And my church told me that it was only 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
So I would actually go to bed, and after being enthralled by the heavens and ask God for forgiveness for, believing the earth was 6,000, not 6,000 years old. It's
Mm,
just
mm.
lived in two worlds for a long time.
Lived in two worlds. That's a really interesting concept. Can you tell me a little bit more? How did that make you feel? How, be, one foot in this side, one foot in this side. How did you manage that?
I learned to wall things off when I went to church or to Bible study, or when I was, they call it witnessing, preaching to other
Hmm.
people to try to convert them. I was full on fundamentalist Christian completely. I was all in on Jesus being the only way to heaven,
Mm,
and it had to be my church's view of Jesus.
hmm.
When I got lost in the wonders of science, when I was outside with my telescope or
Yeah.
playing with my chemistry set, I was able to put the religious stuff behind me and really concentrate on the science that was in front of me.
Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
you learn to wall things off, otherwise they eat you alive. And that's not to
Wow.
say that I didn't have doubt creeping in from both sides. I would be preaching a young Earth to somebody, knowing full well that the Earth was 4.6 billion years old, and then I would go to science class and study the science that taught me how to figure out how old the Earth was.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of pushing things into corners and just pretending you don't you didn't hear them.
Interesting, because um, you know, going back to me for a little bit, so my mother is actually from New Jersey, and we lived in
Okay.
Washington for several years, and I went to high school in the United States. And I remember I did a science fair project, and we started looking at radioactive decay, um, and the half-life of various elements. And
Yeah.
by measuring the amount of uranium radioactivity, you could calculate the age of the universe and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, this is indicating that the world is old, really old, billions of years
Yeah.
old. So
Yes.
that's uh, my journey. I raised in Catholic schools, very Catholic upbringing. But when I started to hit adolescence, I started having all these questions about what I'd been taught. Is this right? I'm now old enough to sort of analyze and challenge and um, calculate things. So why
Hmm.
does the observable world not always line up with religious truth, or what I've been taught
Yeah.
is religious truth? So yeah, it's a very similar experience.
Yeah. I have a side, just for fun, a blog called Bad Science Debunked, where I take on a lot of
Yeah,
these myths, and
yeah.
it's not always religion, but having Ken Ham's Ark Encounter is about an hour away from where I live right here. So,
Mm,
and the Creation
mm,
Museum is an hour away. And the
yeah, yeah,
radioactivity thing you mentioned was very interesting, because when I learned about the half-life and decay,
yeah.
you read books by Ken Ham and he'll say, "Oh, well, that's if I get this word out, uniformitarianism. Yeah, you assuming the half-life was the same, and yet on the other hand, they'll turn around and tell you that the universe was intelligently designed, that
Mm,
all the physical laws that we know of had to be so precise." And to me,
mm,
that would include radioactive decay rates. And
yeah,
you think
yeah,
about what would happen if radioactive decay rates weren't the same. It would have possibly fried
yeah,
everyone on Earth all alive, made it sterile, or perhaps the Earth never would have got going because we wouldn't,
yeah,
maybe have a.
exactly.
So yeah, they contradict themselves, and
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I
yeah.
think there was another thing, like the speed of light, in order to
Oh
account for the
yes,
distance, the speed of light had
yes.
to have changed over time.
Had to
Um,
change,
yeah.
which has yeah, catastrophic consequences. So what
Yeah.
I'm looking for. So some of them will say, "Oh, well, light was created in transit."
Hmm.
It's, physics just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
I'm afraid. If you learn how a photon is emitted and why, it's no.
Exactly, exactly. So, I've sort of hit my teenage years and I'm really starting to think, um, you know, how, because I'm very much a scientific person. My career was in software engineering, but I loved,
Yes, we
um,
talked about that offline.
yeah,
Yeah.
STEM and all of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'm still a person of faith today, but my my understanding is that the Bible is about theological truth as opposed to literal or scientific truth. Um,
Hmm.
and having space in my mind for both of those things has helped me sort of exist uh,
Yeah.
in a better place. But I'd love to hear about a bit more about. So your father, he was the one who said, we're going to this church. This is what we believe. This is
Yeah.
how the family's going to be. Is that what happened? Or tell me
Well,
your experience.
um, sort of.
Mm,
Mom and dad both fall into a trap that I think a lot of people unfortunately fall into, which is that anything religious is good. Now, I'm not saying
of
I'm not here to bash religion.
course
I
not.
know there I know really great religious people. My wife is a Christian.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not that I'm bad, but they just tend to accept that without any question whatsoever. And not
Yeah.
everything in religion is good. So to mom and dad, they didn't really care where their kids went to church as long
Mhm.
as the kids went to church because
Yeah,
supposedly that's where we were learning all our morals and everything. When in truth, I learned my morals from my parents and the world
absolutely.
around me.
Yeah,
So dad was not really a hardcore creationist himself. He just
sure.
believed his mom did in heaven and
Yeah.
church was a good thing. So at that level, they were fine wherever we went to church. And
Mm,
as I got so indoctrinated and it became evident that I was having trouble, I had the chance to switch churches if I wanted to.
hmm.
But by that time, I was too in deep and I was like, no, mom, you don't understand. Dad, you don't understand. This is the true religion. So they unintentionally kind of created a monster by me taking what the church said so seriously.
Yeah. Uh, let's can we elaborate a little bit more on that? So if
Sure.
your
Yeah.
your parents decide, okay, yep, we're happy with you going to a church, who or what kept you into that church, going into this fundamentalist evangelical mindset? What who or what kept you
Oh,
there?
fear, fear,
Fear.
absolute fear. I, for a long time, resisted the call, the altar call that's done at the end of every sermon, even though they'll do all 4 or 5 verses of the hymn and give everyone time, the pressure to walk up there. I resisted that. But when I was very young teen, there was a movie that came to town, and this was the late 70s, early 80s when apocalyptic Christian films, based on Revelation, were very popular. And
Hmm.
the churches encouraged everyone to send their kids. So it was a small southern town just north of the Mason-Dixon line.
Hmm.
So everyone did send their kids. This movie was horrific. This was a time when if someone was shot, for example, like on TV, they didn't show blood. They just grasped their chest and fell up. There was no
Mm,
graphic
mm,
violence, nothing. This movie had graphic violence. This movie had people on fire on screen. This movie had the Whore of Babylon drinking blood and blood running out of her mouth. Children around me were crying. I was curled up
mm,
in my seat in terror. This movie went on and on about how these were the last days. And if we didn't get saved right now, we were in trouble. I
mm.
was so terrified. I went and got baptized the next weekend. So
Wow.
fear is what did it. And the church kept that fear going because, well, there was fear. There's a carrot and stick approach. There's the fear of
Yeah.
burning forever, but there's also the promise of living forever in heaven and not having any troubles.
Mm.
So, but it was mainly the fear that got me.
Mainly the fear that got you. And if we could go back, you mentioned something briefly at the end of the service. They're singing hymns. Were people called to go forward? I'm not familiar with this. Could you just tell me about it?
Oh, yeah, sure. So that's a big thing in evangelical churches. And I don't recall ever seeing it at Mass and Catholic
Hmm.
Church.
Mm,
Usually there, your process to becoming a Catholic is a little more rigid. You've got the classes, the catechism, the whole, in an evangelical world, they preach a sermon, They tell you basically if you're not right with Christ, you could be in trouble tomorrow because the world will end. And
Mm,
everybody stands up and sings a hymn, Come to Jesus hymn. And they'll go on for about five. They're usually very emotional choices that the preacher will sometimes interject, think about what I've told you. Listen to this verse, listen, and he'll repeat words that resonate with the sermon you just heard. So there's a lot of pressure to
hmm
step out into that aisle because you're told from an early age that you're a sinner and you can't be redeemed on your own,
hmm
and you want that redemption. So that's an altar call. I'm very verbose there. I'm
Altar
sorry,
call.
but
Yeah,
it's
that's
yeah,
okay.
in evangelical churches, that's a very common thing. At the end of every service, yeah.
Interesting, interesting. Because I'd love to learn more about other religious experiences. Because at a Catholic mass, it's all fairly um, it's not very exciting. Put it that
It's
way.
I was gonna say, yeah, I didn't want to say boring, but I used to get bored as a little kid a lot, and
Yeah.
they did a lot of masses in Latin. I'm that old, so
Yes.
yeah,
Wow. Yeah. I get to do it in English, which is great.
good for you.
Um,
But still, they're not that
yeah.
exciting.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
scripted. They're very
They're
scripted.
very scripted, and in fact, I've got my Catholic cheat sheet, which is the order of Mass, which has the words and the responses, so I know what to say and when. Um,
Yeah,
and
I know
I
what
think
you're. Yeah,
and for me, I think I do enjoy, or I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but for me, the ritual of the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine, that communion with God, that's meaningful to me. Um,
yeah.
but I think, yeah, other churches, I'm sure, have their various traditions, and I think, you mentioned the carrot and the stick, and I think that does sound to me a little bit like, psychological manipulation. If you don't listen
Very
to me,
much
bad
so.
things will happen. If you do listen to me, you'll be rewarded. Um,
Yes.
and I think, these preachers understand that, and they can
Oh
leverage
yeah.
it to control behavior.
Well, I actually was a preacher for a little while when I was
Hmm
young. The
Okay.
church
Yep.
had their first, I actually have two chapters in my book on this because it was such a vivid memory of being a young child and being recognized as maybe I don't mean to sound arrogant, somewhat
hmm
gifted in reading.
Yeah.
I was reading an adult level
Yep.
around third grade.
Yep.
I read the whole Bible cover to cover as a child over and over.
Oh,
And they said,
wow.
we're going to have a youth day at church. Who's going to be the preacher? Oh, well, Mark is going to do it.
Yep.
So I had to write up my own sermon. And then they thought, wow, that was pretty good. So they had this little program in our area where they would take young men, always
hmm
men, women weren't allowed to preach, and take the young men to different churches and have them deliver sermons. So that's
And
how yeah, go ahead.
well, tell me about that experience. How did that make you feel?
It really made me feel hypocritical in the end. There is a very vivid memory. Again, a lot of my memories, I didn't have vivid memories. We went to a
Mm-hmm.
very small Kentucky coal mining town, and the tendency here in Eastern Kentucky in Appalachia is the coal companies come in, they provide jobs for a while, they mine the resources out, they leave the area polluted, and then move on. This town was, I don't name the town, but there were only two buildings in that town that were actually structurally sound. There was a
Mm-hmm.
McDonald's and there was a modern church.
Mm-hmm.
All the other homes were people who were on public assistance, mobile homes, broken down cars, appliances, wild animals or feral animals running around. And I was standing in that church delivering a fire and brimstone sermon. I learned how to imitate these
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
revival preachers. I can explain revivals in a minute because they don't have those in
Sure.
Catholicism. But so I'm doing this and slamming the lectern, and it thunder clapped outside. And for some reason, I lost my train of thought and I went to thinking about all these people who had donated money to this church, the only nice building in town besides McDonald's, and they are literally living there with windows broken out and plastic,
Mm-hmm.
covering the
Mm-hmm.
window. And I felt like such a hypocrite. I felt like I should have been
Wow.
telling I should have been Jesus overturning the table, the money changers
Yeah.
tables. I should have been telling these people in this church, why aren't you out there helping these people who are hungry and don't have homes to live in? So
Mm.
that experience turned me away from, I finished the sermon. They told me I did a really good job, but the whole way home, I felt like such a hypocrite. Never forget that moment.
Wow. So that really sounds like an important turning point in your
It
story.
was one of many, yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed.
Speaking of which, so you've written a book, Journey to Reason. Will you tell me a little bit about
Yes,
that?
sure. So the book is a memoir. It describes young earth creationism, indoctrination, the conflicts between science and
Mm.
religion that I think sometimes maybe, at least for young earth creationism, it's a conflict that doesn't need to be there. You don't need to believe the earth is 6,000 years old to be a
Yeah.
Christian. So the
Yeah.
book is not anti-religious in any shape or form. As a matter of fact, it's been endorsed by people who are elders in churches,
Hmm.
but it
Hmm.
does go after fundamentalism. I believe myself, my claim is that fundamentalism indoctrination is child abuse. And
Absolutely. I
we
agree.
have a lot of that going on right now in Kentucky with private religious schools, private home education. These children are receiving the same kind of indoctrination that I did. I
Mm.
first got my break in writing for the National Center for Science Education. Actually, they sent me to the Ark Encounter as someone who had been indoctrinated but came over to science. And I remember seeing the children that I describe in my book. They were just like me. They were so into the religion, just like me.
Yeah.
And I felt
Yeah.
so bad for them. So the book just takes you on a journey from my first experience. I was told I was going to burn in hell because I described rainbows to my Sunday school class. I don't know if we would go to that story or not, but it goes through a whole series of the chapters are 4 or 5 pages long, and they're just little individual stories that collectively add up to why I made the decision that I did to walk away from
Mm.
religion. So again, it's not anti-religious. I don't try to
Of course. Of course.
convert people, but I do ask people to stop and ask, are you really helping your children with what you're teaching them? Look a little more closely at what's being taught.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think, when we raise our children, we want the best for them. We want to give
Yes,
them
absolutely.
life and knowledge and experience. But I think you're absolutely right that when we indoctrinate children to believe that anyone who doesn't agree with us 100% is an enemy is,
Is an enemy.
yeah.
Yes. Oh, you froze up for just a second. I'm sorry, I missed your last sentence.
For staying on the call. I really appreciate it. Um,
Oh,
so
sure.
I wanted so let's say you're a young person, you've been indoctrinated into one of these fundamentalist churches, and you're starting to question it.
Yes.
What is your advice for that sort of young person who is beginning to question their indoctrination?
Uh, do not give up faith in yourself. Do
Hmm.
not believe that you're a bad person. Don't believe
Hmm.
that you're unworthy. Be confident in asking questions. Don't back down when people threaten you when you ask questions. Learn to think for yourself. That is the best thing I think
Hmm.
anyone can
Hmm.
do. I'm often told by fundamentalists that universities are indoctrinating our children. I've never had a calculus professor. I once proved 0 = 1 in calculus. I got
Yeah,
a bad grade, but the professor never threatened me with burning.
yeah, of
So,
course,
as a child, realize if somebody is threatening you with something, then there's probably something wrong there.
absolutely. And it's just come back to my you mentioned uh, you were criticized or challenged for describing rainbows. Can you tell me that story?
Yes, I have had a love affair with rainbows my entire life. I've been fascinated with them. We had a teacher come into science class very early in grade school with this little glass pyramid. and he walked over to a window where there was a beam of light and held it up, and a rainbow appeared on the wall, and it was like magic. And
Yeah,
he
I love that
explained to his,
expression.
yes, he explained as best he could to young children about refraction, that white light was made up of a light of different wavelengths, et cetera, et cetera. And it just so happened that I went to church, to Sunday school not long after that, and we were studying Noah and the flood and
Hmm.
how God, forgive me, I have to criticize fundamentalism here at least.
Go
God
ahead.
drowned all these innocent children and babies, which is another story. But at the end of it, he sent a rainbow that is a promise it won't happen. And my hand shot up immediately. I said, "Oh no, rainbows have been around as long as there's been sunlight and something to." And I went into this lecture on refraction, and the
Yeah.
teacher stopped me, red faced, told the class that Satan was talking through Mark, and that I think the quote was, "He had me by the heels and he was pulling me down to hell. And don't listen to him." And I got a lecture, don't talk like that. Don't talk like that in church. You don't contradict God's word. And this was all over. So I went home and my dad took me out. I didn't realize he was tricking me. He said, "I can show you how to make rainbows." We had no Amazon.com back then. There was no internet. We couldn't go get a prism, but he had a
Hmm.
water hose and he shot it up in the air and showed me how to make rainbows. And then he said, "Oh, by the way, the car needs to be washed. Here's a bucket of soap." So I got to wash the car in addition to making, but what he did unknowingly is reinforced my obstinance, because I would go back to church again and challenge them and say, "No, you're not right about the rainbows." And I had a lot of teachers just get so mad they would stop talking to me, or they would usually change the subject. I think they talked to my parents a few times, but
Mm.
yeah, the threats there were usually, "Mark, you're burning in hell," was is enough to shut me up for a while. But then I would go home and just stand there for hours playing with that water hose until mom and dad said, "Mark, you're running the water bill up." And I knew the church was wrong. I was just a little kid, but I knew the church was wrong.
That's remarkable. So, y- having being told as a child, Satan is speaking through Mark. Don't listen to Mark. That
Yeah,
that's really that must have been so.
it happens a lot here.
Happens a
It
lot, doesn't it?
happens,
Really?
it does when you speak now. I almost hate to say the word atheist because it has so many negative
Mm.
connotations. I usually just say I'm a non-believer. But as
Yeah.
soon as that comes up in a conversation with someone, their attitude towards me changes
Yeah.
instantly. No matter how nice I've been to them, no matter the good things I may have done, uh,
Mm.
they don't see me as the same person anymore, because I am not
Yeah.
speaking the truth. I'm not speaking the word of God. This is
Yeah.
very common in fundamentalism.
Absolutely. And a little bit of my own journey, having been raised as a Catholic and then really starting to question it as a teenager, and again the story of Noah and the flood. Why would God drown all these children?
Yeah,
The story of the book of
Pharaoh and the
Joshua.
firstborn. Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
when basically the Israelites have come into the Holy Land and they're taking possession. We basically, there's bits in there that says, you know, we bravely slaughtered everyone, showing
slaughtered
absolutely no
everyone.
mercy, while they treacherously begged us for peace.
Yes,
It's
except for
very
the little
difficult.
girls. Remember
Yeah.
Moses getting mad at his brother because he spared some of the young boys and he kept the little girls. That
Mm.
should tell you something. That should
It,
tell you something.
it
If
is,
you
and
take
it's
that story
extremely
literally.
challenging if you take it literally. And again, I think so. I had a period of hardcore atheism in my life when I was from 18 to about 20. I was like,
Yeah,
God can't
interesting.
exist, God shouldn't exist, God mustn't exist. But if I might share my journey a little bit, when I
Oh,
was
please do. Yes.
absolutely, I'd love to tell you. So when uh, I did software engineering at university. I love working with computers. And one of the first things you learn in software engineering, software engineering 101, is logic and how
Yes.
to construct an argument. and we learned things like modus ponens, modus tollens, inductive proofs, all these things, how to prove things. And I love
Yeah.
that. That was absolutely fascinating to me. And the other aspect of it was I love storytelling. As a kid, I absolutely loved video games and
Oh
the
yeah.
stories that they could tell. Legend of Zelda was a favorite of mine,
Yeah.
uh, and Baldur's Gate. I think I've I've still got it on my shelf there, which is a Dungeons and Dragons game, and
Oh
a
my
lot of the
gosh.
fundamentalists
Wow.
really don't like Dungeons and Dragons. Um,
Wow.
so I did software engineering. I wanted to be a game developer. In the end, I got a job in Sydney working for a finance company. And it's a bit like, getting a job on Wall Street and moving to New York. It was highly competitive. Something for like 200 or 300 people went for this job, and I got it. So I moved to the big city to start this career. But pretty soon, having left my family, being a 20-year-old man alone in the big city, I got involved with drugs and drug gangs,
Hmm.
and pretty soon I had a psychotic breakdown.
Oh wow.
It was extremely harrowing. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I had to move back
Goodness.
in with my parents, and I was in the psych ward for about 6 months. Um,
Wow.
so very, very painful, difficult, and it really led me to sort of reevaluate. Is chasing money what I really want to do with my life? Is and I think in order to heal from this massive setback in my life, I started, I returned to thoughts of religion and faith, and
Sure.
ultimately, yeah, what I experienced was, okay, I tried atheism and it didn't go well for me. What now? And I think what I realized, and everyone's journey is valid, everyone's journey is unique.
Of
Um,
course.
but for me, I and this is what I often ask guests on my podcast. I felt a calling. I
Mm,
felt like something greater than me was calling me back, and that's what sort of caused my return, or began my return to the church. Um, and now
interesting.
I'm studying theology, and it's if someone to ask what is theology, it's faith seeking understanding.
Hmm.
So we look at the Bible critically and we try to understand, okay, what's the truth here? And just about all the people in the academic community will say, okay, the Bible is about theological truth. And there are some really interesting unsolved questions about the nature of humanity. But I
Hmm.
think for me, the redemptive arc of Christology really spoke to me, that you can make big mistakes, you can make
Yeah.
poor choices, but there is hope, there is redemption, there is forgiveness. So that's where I'm at the
That's
moment.
that's a wonderful story. I actually know people, some people very well, some people very close to me who have struggled with
Mm,
problems like addiction, and
yeah,
religion
exactly.
was the answer that they found. And no problem with that at all. I
Yeah,
think that if you find something that speaks to you and it helps you,
yeah,
stick with it. You're not hurting anyone. You're not trying to force your beliefs on others. And I try really hard to point that out in the book, that I do. There are people, and a lot of people in the world like you, who just find meaning there, and that's
yeah.
okay. That's a good thing.
Absolutely, and I think there's common ground to be shared here. That I'm still a very logical, analytical person. I like to challenge what I've been told and see are there any weaknesses in this argument?
Yes.
And exactly, and I think there's a lot of wisdom and fruit to be gained out of an honest debate. Um,
Yeah.
but so what is your hope for the world, Mark? You mentioned you don't
you want to prevent the abuse of children through fundamentalist indoctrination.
Yeah.
If you could change something in the world, what would you change?
If I could change things, I would start here at home, of course, because the country I live in, the county I live in, the city I live in, that's where
Mm,
I supposedly have a vote. We have, I'm sure you heard of gerrymandering. Where I
yeah,
live is so gerrymandered that my vote in a lot of cases doesn't count. But
yeah,
I would push for more education, a
hmm,
lot more money on social spending, on getting everyone, whether they, I'm not saying that you need to go to college to be a good person, but just bring people up to the best understanding that we have
yeah,
of the world we live in, because these are, we're asked every day in this technological society really important questions. Is it safe for this plant to move in next to me and start dumping the refuse into the local water supply?
yeah,
Is it
yeah,
safe for, we have to answer these questions,
mm,
even to the conspiracy theories. Is 5G safe? Are vaccines safe? I think we need to be prepared as best we can to answer questions like that. And I think education is the path forward.
hmm, mm,
That's where I would start, and let it go from there. If someone wants to turn to religion, my wife and I often discuss what we would do. We met a little too late in life to really have children of our own, but
hmm,
how would we have raised those children given the differences in our religion? And I was of the mind, if they really had to go to church, I wanted to talk to them afterwards, but I would
yeah,
rather hope that they would be a little older when they started their religious experience so that they did
mhm,
have what you and I have, this gift of being able to question things and think
yeah,
critically. So that's my vision for the world, and which automatically excludes things like uh, people blowing each other's mosques up or attacking
yeah,
synagogues or
exactly, exactly.
churches or telling people they can't get married, or those things automatically go out the window when you have a critical thought process, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree, and I I really dislike it when, you know, religion, particularly the fundamentalist, um, factions that we've been discussing,
Yes.
rationalize terrible things. Exactly as you said, attacks on
Yes.
synagogues, attacks on mosques, all these things. It's just not right, and I think, and it's wonderful to have people like you in the world
Thank you.
advocating for education, which I agree with 100%. Um, I, uh, I I really liked school. I wasn't a very social kid, at least not at the time, but
Same here.
I loved you know the mathematics, the sciences, biology. I still remember my
Yeah.
year 9 biology teacher, Miss Farias,
Oh,
and
wow.
we started talking about you know where does life begin? Is it at the moment of conception? Is it like this whole continuous chain? Is it the moment of
It's an
birth?
interesting question.
Yeah, exactly. And we discussed evolution, and I'm a firm believer in evolution. Um, and but I know that at the time, this was back late 90s, early 2000s, that you know evolution was quite controversial in certain schools. I went to a private school,
Oh, yeah.
and there was no problem there. But you know, I think I'm just repeating myself. But when teachers tell children things that are patently untrue must be true because it's religiously important, I think that's a real disservice to young people, and it really sets them up for failure. And I'm so glad that you were able to escape this world.
I think the fundamental thing that I would ask of everybody is to just be able to admit you're wrong.
Yeah,
I'm willing to admit I'm wrong about anything, and that
Yeah.
would include, some people said they're going to say, oh, wait, Mark, you're an agnostic. No, I'm not. I would admit that God existed if I had evidence for it. I do not
Mm.
find that evidence, but I'm willing to admit I'm wrong. On the
Yeah.
other hand, the fundamentalists, the Ken Hams of the world, absolutely, positively, the Bible is the truth, it's the whole truth, it's
Yeah.
unchanging, that nothing will ever change their mind. And it puts you in a horrible position when you admit that, because you're telling people,
Yeah.
hey, I could know I'm wrong, and I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to admit it. I could know that this airplane doesn't have enough fuel, but I'm taking
Yeah.
off anyway.
Yeah.
And that's just,
Exactly.
there's something really wrong there.
And I agree again, the ability to, when you it's not a great feeling when you're presented with the facts and you realize, okay, I got that one wrong. So I
Yeah.
think we all need to be willing to understand that, or at least open to the idea of uh, examining new evidence and possibly
Yes.
correcting what we've looked at
Yes.
in what we've come to believe. And I think a great example is sort of the atom. And again, this is going back to high school in the United States
I
when
think
we
I know
were
where you're
trying.
going.
Yeah,
Keep
we
going, keep
started with
going.
the plum pudding, and then we had electrons in orbits around the atoms. That's what I was
Hmm.
taught. But since
Hmm.
then, we've learned about the quantum energy levels, and
Yeah,
electrons are probably in this
they're
place.
probably there in up quarks and down quarks and
All
pieces
these
that,
things.
subatomic part. Yeah, all
Yeah,
those
and
things that we weren't taught.
exactly. And the closer you look, the weirder it gets. So
Yeah,
so I think it's really important to acknowledge that our understanding in all things is incomplete, and that
yes,
trying to say that, okay, this is the whole truth, this is the complete understanding of our world, this is all there is to know. I think that type of thinking is extremely dangerous.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, look, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, Mark.
It's
I really
yes.
appreciate your time. And look, is there something, if people have stuck with us to the end of this conversation, is there something you would like them to do now?
I of course would always put a plug in for the book,
For the book?
because this is, I've written before, but this is my first solo effort, so I'm
Yes.
would really like to give people a look into the mindset of what's driving conservative, at least conservative America. I know there's fundamentalists in other countries, but if
Mm.
you want that look, and then I'll mention I'll have another one coming out, I'm hoping at the end of September, that takes the first book, because nobody, who's Mark Alsip? It's just, it's an
Yeah.
interesting memoir, but why is what he's saying relevant? And I tie that to things like, if you've heard of Project 2025, the Republican uh, blueprint for how America
Yes.
would look as a theocracy. I
Yeah.
look into accelerated Christian education. The I've been buying off of eBay a huge
Yeah.
stack of the books and reading them. So I try to tie all that together. But yeah, I would just encourage them, if they're interested in this kind of topic, go look me up, sorry, on Amazon,
Yeah.
and give the book it's a free download if you got Kindle Unlimited. So
Oh,
there's my
cool.
sales
Yes, I've
pitch.
got
There's
Kindle.
my
I love
sales pitch.
Kindle.
I'll get it out. I'm
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
I'm done selling things now. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's been a delight. And the book is Journey to Reason by
Yes.
Mark Alsip, and it's
Yes.
available on Amazon as
And
an ebook
Audible. Great Audible.
and a
Great
book.
Audible book too. Yeah. Yeah.
Such a pleasure speaking to you today, Mark.
Thank you, sir. All right. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye for now. So long.
All right. Bye.